Sorry, I did the. Okay. Welcome everyone, and we'll start. So for those of you who missed it, we're going to start with Celia, then Pierrick, and then we'll go to Christos. Everyone's got half an hour. If I can ask you to please try to stick with the time. And at the end of all three papers, we'll open up questioning for everyone. Okay, the floor is yours, Celia.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for this opportunity. So I'm sorry I missed the morning session, that I have a very huge time difference. And so I don't have a PowerPoint, but I will share my screen. I think it's better if you can follow the text yourselves. There. So my paper is entitled Emotional Expectations, Husserlian Reflections on our emotional relation to the future and the possibility of regulating negative emotional dispositions. Just a very quick, some information about the paper and me. So I work on Husserl's phenomenology. I've been working in Husserlian phenomenology of value and willing consciousness for a long time, since my PhD. And this is my first experience connecting Husserl with Husserlian phenomenology with the topic of mindfulness. So this is just to say that this is a work in progress, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. So I will read the paper. I begin. In this paper, I approach Husserl's perspective on our emotional relation to the future. And I do this by analyzing particularly the notion of emotional expectation, a concept used by Husserl in different works and contexts to describe a subject's relation towards what is coming as an affective tension. My aim is to explore the possible contributions of Husserl's analysis of the relation between different levels and temporal phases of consciousness to the debate in mindfulness regarding the possibility to focus on present experience and observing emotions. So first, I will present the concept of emotional expectation in the framework of Husserlian phenomenology, and I will give an overview of the sedimentation and resonance of feelings in emotional dispositions. And second, I will refer to the possibility of regulating negative emotional dispositions by analyzing the role of attention in redirecting consciousness to the now and in the observation of emotions. In general terms, I will try to briefly describe the passive genesis of dispositions that delineate present experience and expectations regarding the future, and also to explore the possibility of actively intervening in the present to reconfigure this passive predelineation. So the first section is entitled The Concept of Emotional Expectation in Husserl's Phenomenology. According to Husserl, all our present experiences incorporate an anticipation of the future. Distancing from the doctrine of momentary consciousness, Husserl holds that consciousness in each of its phases reaches out beyond the now. Accordingly, in the lectures on the phenomenology of inner time consciousness, he describes the triple intentionality involved in time consciousness as follows. The primary perception intends what is actually given in the present. The primary recollection or retention holds what has just passed, and the primary expectation or pretension corresponds to the immediate awareness of the future. The phenomenological approach to the future has motivated some controversies. The openness and undetermination of the future seems to threaten any attempt to a phenomenological description. As James Mesh resumed, if phenomenology's focus is on presence or giveness, I quote, at first glance, a phenomenological account of the future seems a contradiction in terms, end of quote. What kind of giveness corresponds to an intention directed to the future? Can we say that we perceive it? Concerning specifically the Husserlian approach, it has been pointed out by scholars that Husserl tends to consider the consciousness of the future as analogous to the consciousness of the past, and therefore to view pretensions and retention as symmetrical phenomena. Compared to the amount of analysis devoted by Husserl to retention, pretension seems to have received a minor treatment. However, the dominant interpretation seems to be declining and giving way to a more comprehensive appraisal of Husserl's phenomenology of time, which recognizes the importance of his reflections regarding the anticipation of what is yet not given. Husserl addresses the anticipation of the future in two levels: the original awareness of the future in pretensions, which is a rigid and passive process, and expectations that depend on our past experience and are movable insofar as they depend on the changes of our experiences. Expectations do not have the form of explicit judgment. In Husserl's terminology, they are presentifications intertwined with presentations, such as perceptions, and motivated by them. The relation between pretension and expectation is a quite difficult topic, and I will dare to resume it only by saying that the difference concerns an originary empty awareness of the coming phase of consciousness and a secondary actual presentification of what is coming. Pretensions as primary modes of temporal consciousness open the present to the future, but they do, as said, in an empty way, while expectations make the future present as recollections make the past present as past. In making the future present, expectations tends to anticipate the future following the style of the past, and its force can increase depending on the number of instances that confirms the expectation. Regarding the role of the past in anticipating the future, Husserl affirmed that, I quote, "We do not direct ourselves to the future with wide open arms," end of quote. This means that we are always projecting with different grades of determination and more or fewer possibilities of real fulfillment. So this anticipatory structure is inseparable from every experience. Expectations are involved not only when I, for instance, perceive an aspect of an object and expect the hidden aspect to be the same, but also when I feel joy and when I set a practical goal. This is due to the fact that the structure primal perception, retention, pretension is a purely formal temporal structure of every experience. However, it is perhaps trivial to say that the expectations are not exactly the same in perception as they are in the case of emotions and practical intentions, and that the anticipation of a joy is different from the anticipation of an aspect of an object. For the least, we can say that the anticipation of a joy involves an enthusiasm that in the case of the perception of a hidden aspect of an object is mainly absent. More generally, we could say that while many perceptual processes can be emotionally indifferent, it is difficult to remain indifferent to the anticipation of an emotion. Thus, we can speak of emotional expectations when the expectation is related to a present emotional experience. A present feeling, valuation, or willing act gives place to an expectation that is emotional because it belongs to the sphere of Gemüt. That's what I translated. It's usually translated as emotion. In Husserl's terminology, feeling, valuing, and willing are emotional experiences, Gemütserlebnisse. They belong to the non-theoretical and also non-objectifying dimension of consciousness. But on the other hand, the expectation can be emotionally colored regardless of what kind of act it's at stake, and can anticipate something perceptually, and on the ground of the same perceptual intention, an emotional expectation can arise. Let's take a basic example of an emotional expectation based on a perception. If I see a door and a person behind the door, and I anticipate that the door will open and that the person will enter the room. In this case, my expectation is not only doxical, so related to perception, because I also want the person behind the door to enter the room. Besides the presentification of what will happen, door opening, person entering, emotionally, my expectation is not oriented towards this purely objectual aspect, door, person behind the door, person entering, but to the value of the door opening and the person entering the room. Regarding these, expectations are considered by Husserl as phenomena very close to desires. Husserl's reflections on expectations based on emotional and practical intentions show that they are very complex phenomena, For instance, the expectation involved in a willing resolution has the character of an anticipation of the fulfillment of the will. When I resolve to act, I expect that every singular phase of the action will be fulfilled. This expectation at play is not neutral, it is emotional because it's founded on my will. For its part, expectations involved in emotional acts are interesting because every emotion regarding a future event has in its base the belief in the existence of the event. Husserl gives the example of a joy regarding a future trip to Paris, but this also applies to negative emotions. For instance, if I suffer in the present because I expect suffering to come and I conceive this as inevitable. This is a common phenomenon and is especially found in people suffering from chronic pain, emotional or psychical, which can even worsen with the diagnosis of a disease that leads the person to interpret any corporal change as an alert sign of the imminent and inevitable coming suffering. So summing up, we can speak of emotional expectation regarding expectation bound to proper emotional experience. The present joy motivates the expectation of a future joy, and regarding colored expectations that accompany every kind of act as mere perceptions. In both cases, there is no doubt that the emotional character differs from the phenomenon addressed by Husserl in his lectures on time consciousness. So how do they exactly differ? In a recently published manuscript, Husserl explicitly distinguishes these two forms of expectations. He speaks of intellectuelle Erwartungen, intellectual expectations, as the simple foreseeing of the future, and Gemütserwartungen, emotional expectation. And in an earlier text, he also used this expression to describe the emotionally looking forward to what is coming or being anxious about what is coming. So this is a difference in translation because I was not sure how to translate das Gefühlsmäßige Gespanntsein auf das Kommen. This understanding sorry, of expectation as a tension, which differs from expectation as a basic mode of temporal consciousness, seems to correspond to a specific emotional form of being oriented towards the future. Husserl describes emotionally colored expectations as follows. So I'm quoting from Husserliana 43, the third volume. He says, I expect something, a disjunction. I don't know which of the possibilities will occur, but one of them will occur. I can anticipate that. I know that in plain dice, for instance, and I'm just anxious about what will come, about how it turns out to be. The tension, this emotional state finds its release. But also when I'm certain of what will occur, I'm eventually anxious. The lover will surely arrive. I cannot wait for it, which means I cannot bear at all the sweet agony of expecting. I mean a feverish expectation. So according to this, the expectation can be more or less determined. Sometimes I only know within certain margins what will occur, and sometimes it is more determined. I know exactly what will happen, and nevertheless, I am tense towards it. Expectations moves in a field of relative determination, and the degree of its affective tension depends on this degree of determination or undetermination. So taking a concrete example, it has been analyzed the role of the undetermination of the future in the feeling of anxiety. So according to Mikali, for example, anxiety would increase depending on the uncertainty of the future. So this analysis of emotional expectations face Husserl to the question on whether they correspond to a primitive form of consciousness, and to the more difficult question of how the complex relation between intellectual and emotional dimensions of consciousness should be understood. Without going deep into Husserl's intricate reflections on this, I will only point out two aspects of Husserl's conception of emotional expectation that can be drawn from his reflections. So I will resume these two because I don't want to extend too much. So on the one side, Husserl considers that the emotional expectation is not another class of fact independent from temporal expectation, but the same with an emotional color. I previously referred to the color of experience. Husserl uses this expression, colored intention, tingierte intención, and Farben. So in an early manuscript, for example, he writes that an intellectual state is perhaps never free from emotional coloring. And so it's interesting that he writes vice versa. So it would be also the other way around. And this color of experience for Husserl is originally constituted by an evaluative intention called valueception. So this is maybe too specific, but for Husserl, there is a specific value intention, which is emotional, and he uses this neologism Wert Nemun, which can be translated as valueceptions. Valueception, that word doesn't exist, but Wert Nemun doesn't exist either. So only in Husserl's vocabulary. And this valueception constitutes the value of objects, and this value is the fundament of the emotion linked to it. For example, a joy. So what is evaluative apprehended motivates a joy that colors in turn the objects. I will go now to the second point. Husserl understands both forms of expectation in a relation of analogy. The analogy grounds on the idea that both forms can be fulfilled or disappointed. However, the fulfillment has different forms. While perceptual intentions, for instance, are fulfilled through intuition, they are confirmed, emotional expectations are only fulfilled when the affective tension is released. In this case, the fulfillment has the character of the satisfaction. This is not merely a terminological distinction. I think that it means that the satisfaction of an emotion is independent of the confirmation of the intention of the founding act, for instance, a perception. So if the perception of an object arouses a state of pleasure or relaxation, perceiving every side of this object does not necessarily decrease or increase my relaxation. The intention of the founding act, the perception, for instance, can be confirmed, but the pleasure is not immediately exhausted. And this makes the emotional intentions in general relatively independent from doxic intentions. So to this point, it's clear that the concept of emotional expectation is connected to the phenomenon of dispositions, Gesinnung, and even to moods, Stimmungen, and that it should be understood in connection with the phenomenological concept of originality. Emotional expectations have their origin in the sedimentation that rules every experience. Feeling does not escape from the process of habitualization according to which present experience follows the rule of what we have experienced in the past. Husserl writes that also here in the sphere of feeling, everything is incorporated to the habitual. On the one side, we have a feeling habituality and dispositions, and on the other side, we have a correlative typification of feelings. Feelings and value characters are incorporated to the habitual experience in a way that, I quote, "From now on, we grasp the habitual value character of an object." A resonance of a feeling gives place to the configuration of a total Gefühlsmilieu. Husserl speaks in this context of habitual feeling orientations, habituelle Gefühlsrichtungen, habitual emotional properties, habituelle Gemütseigenschaften, and permanent emotional dispositions. So Husserl's examples concern positive emotional dispositions that color our present experience. For instance, an optimistical disposition towards the future, a practical confidence has to accompany human action. One of the most interesting reflections in this regard can be found in his text on ethics, where he affirms that the rational belief in the sense of the word and in the meaning of human action is the necessary imperative to act rationally in the face of adversity. But he also speaks of negative colors of experience, of the obscure horizon of senselessness that threatens human attempts to act rationally. This sense of senselessness can extend and cover everything that is connected to the present experience, Moreover, the color can extend even over the things that do not have an axiological color by themselves. They borrow the color until the color finally becomes an emotional background of the world. In this case, we anticipate an emotional and volitional sense of the world that has a totalizing character. Generally considered, Husserl's analysis of emotions comprehend emotional life as a gradual process that goes from the most primary passive levels towards active emotional acts, which can in turn sink into passivity. In this way, there is a movement backward and forwards of emotions and a graduality between passivity and activity. According to this, affectivity predelineates our experience from the beginning. In this case, we can speak of an emotive background or better emotional background, but also gives place to proper acts which sediment, transfer their color to other experiences, and become a secondary passivity, a habituality. We can speak here of emotive projection in virtue of sedimentation. As I understand Husserl's philosophy, between the two poles of passivity, emotional passivity as primal and emotional passivity as a product of sedimentation of experience, the possibility of activity can be found. In the present, in the moment of action, attention and will can intervene. I will turn now to this aspect. So the second section, which is the last, because the work has only two sections, is called entitled Attending to Emotions and Attending to the Present. So as we have seen, expectations are based on a passive association that predelineates the future according to the style of the past. Considering this, we can say that to a great extent, the phenomenology of expectations is based on the phenomenology of recollection. If we ask what motivates expectations, what do I expect A and not B, our experience shows that we are not entirely free to determine what we expect. In many cases, a stretch of the past just breaks through abruptly in the present. So are we just abandoned to this motivational dynamic of the phases of consciousness? Are we prisoners of our habitual dispositions? In the case of the negative past experiences, which can be called traumatic experiences, we could not avoid constantly projecting a disturbing emotion into the future. And this negative emotional expectation would not only negatively color our present experience, since the call from the past directed towards the future certainly impacts in the present, but would also prevent us to focus on the present moment by drawing us away from it, throwing us into a painful future that torments us. The situation in which our present experience is overwhelmed by the negative expectation of the future can be explained by saying not only that there is a negative expectation regarding the future, but also that our consciousness of the future is excessively determined in its content or excessively undetermined. So I am certain that something will happen, or I'm extremely uncertain of what will happen. Moreover, at the same time that the future is negatively colored, it's considered as more significant than the present. This has been pointed out in the same book of Stefano Micali on anxiety. In this background, I would like to present some aspects of Husserl's phenomenology that could contribute to the clarification of the possibility to focus on the present experience, which is a key issue in mindfulness debates. So according to one of its definitions, I found these definitions in Bishop and others. So the practice of mindfulness implies focusing on the present, which is sometimes referred to as a necessary step to quiet the mind, non-judgmental observation of mental states, which, as I understand, aims to avoid negative reactive thoughts in the present state of mind, and third, acknowledging the feelings that arise in the attentional field. This is also expressed as remaining alert and noticing distractions. With respect to the possibility to focus on the present, it is important to recall that, according to Husserl, every experience involves past, present, and future temporal modes. This is what is meant by the concept of an extended present. The now is always and essentially a border point of an extent of time. That was a quote. However, there is a possibility to concentrate in the living now phase of consciousness, in which the consciousness is actual and can be active. As I understand, the main contribution of Husserl's phenomenology to think an active intervention that allows focusing in the present comes from the phenomenological understanding of attention as a modification of intensity that can favor one of the time phases, and from his text on the observation of emotions. Considering this, in what follows, I outline some ways in which Husserl's phenomenology could contribute to think possible active interventions to focus on the present and to focus on the emotions that direct us negatively towards the future. The first point is something that in other papers in this conference was already described. Husserlian conception of attention. It's making the now experience patent, the reflective function of attention. According to Husserl, every experience can be described as an interplay of actual and potential levels, where some elements come to the foreground in the field of perception. With its turning towards, attention favors or privileges some objects and rejects others. Husserl tried to account for two dimensions that converge in attentive consciousness: its reactive character and its voluntary directionality. Attention can be then understood as a reaction to a stimulus. In this case, the turning towards is passively conditioned, and B, as a voluntary direction of consciousness. If I'm actively interested in something given in the broad field of perception, I can voluntarily make it the object of my intention. So attention in its voluntary form can also operate after the turning towards instaurated by an stimulus. When I react to a stimulus, I can keep my attention grasping it, or I can let it go if I'm not interested in it. Further, attention can make that something given in the broader field of noticing, that's Emergence, that has not yet stimulated me becomes stimulating. So this is to say that attentive consciousness involves both stimulation and participation, Erregung and Beteiligung. As I mentioned, the most fruitful aspect of attention that can be taken into consideration with regards to this topic is the reflective turning towards of attention, reflective Zuwendung. The reflective function of attention is a modification that can make the now moment a phenomenon for the ego, without adding a second act. In reflective attention, the now becomes patent as now. I live in the now as now for me. Naturally, the now has its past and future temporal horizons, but reflective attention can focus on the now phase and turn what is given in the now into a lived experience. In this respect, Husserl distinguishes the pre-phenomenal character of an experience and its being phenomenon for the ego. I will go to the next point because I don't want to exceed the time that I have. The possibility of observing emotions. This is an important point regarding the topic of the paper. Intrusive emotions, for instance, in the form of negative expectations, are one of the main threats to present awareness. To my knowledge, in at least 2 occasions, Husserl considered the possibility of observing emotions. For instance, in the notes on the doctrine of attention and interest, he considers that we can make the color of our experience the object of our interest. We can consider it even if that implies provisionally suspending the coloring. He writes, if I'm angry about something, the reflection, the meditation, Besinnung is the word, can decrease the anger. I experience it immediately as a contrary force, but I feel the anger lasting in time, although in another way of being. These are descriptively completely different states. That's published in the 38th volume of Husserlian. We can also find reflections on this topic in a text which is called Gefühlsbewusstsein, Bewusstsein von Gefühlen, where Husserl expresses his reaction to Geiger's work, Das Bewusstsein von Gefühlen. Contrary to Geiger, who considered that feelings are not accessible to internal observation because they absorb the whole field of consciousness, Husserl analyzes deeply this possibility and holds that feelings are not immune to observation. The view according to which feelings cannot be observed bases on the idea that consciousness cannot neutrally focus on feelings because they contaminate the observation in a way that suspends the object orientation of consciousness. According to this, we couldn't observe the feeling without completely losing sight of what motivates it. If I'm sad or in a sad mood, and I focus on my present sadness, I will soon be absorbed by it and I won't be able to analyze it. In short, emotions are elusive and distracting when we try to grasp them. We cannot directly attend to them without losing the possibility of examining them. Challenging this view, Husserl considers that we can be aware of emotions and we can observe them in a way that they could possibly gain clarity and distinction without losing their emotional quality. It is important to notice that Husserl is only referring here to emotions as joy and sadness and not to feeling sensation as pain and pleasure. That is, he refers only to the emotional intentional experiences with object orientation. In this case, a shift in attention can make the emotion move to the foreground and leave the representational consciousness in the background. This does not imbue consciousness because we can still shift and look into the object of the feeling. It is there only in a modified manner. In Husserl's terms, it's actual but non-thematic. And I have only two more points and I finish. The possibility of approving of emotions. Once the function of observation of emotions is established, we can approve of or disapprove of an emotion as being adequate or inadequate in a given situation. According to Husserl, emotions can undergo a process of clarification by virtue of which I can confirm the adequation of, for instance, a joy regarding the value of the object or situation. Interestingly, Husserl describes disapproval of feeling as a secondary feeling, as a feeling directed to a primary feeling. The secondary emotional character of approval makes it very close to the concept of emotional position taking. Although Husserl's understanding of approval as a secondary feeling has not yet been deeply investigated, I consider this to be an important aspect to take into consideration in order to explore the convergence of emotions and intellect. And the last point is the possibility to actively motivate the emergence of positive emotional expectations by attending to present positive emotions and engaging with positive values. So we said that attention can be turned to the now moment and to emotions. What is the outcome of this regarding the emergence of expectations? According to the mentioned dynamic of sedimentation, emotional expectations can be reinforced by each instance. Turning attention to a particular kind of emotions reinforces repetitive patterns or habitualities. Every time I actively attend to an emotion, a chain of intentions connected to it, including expectations, is triggered. Although this cannot be found in an explicit form in Husserl's work, I think there are descriptive elements to substantiate the claim that by actively attending or privileging a particular kind of emotions in the present, let's say positive emotions, a new dynamic of habitualities can arise, a dynamic that could give place to the emergence of new positive expectations in the future and regarding the future. As I understand, commitment to values is a central moment of this reconfiguration. I must grasp the value of an emotion and acknowledge it as more positive for me and for everyone else, approve of it and commit to it in order to engage in the process of self-reconfiguration. Husserl's late reflections on the values of love, I think that go in this direction. So just a few words to close. These aspects of Husserl's descriptions show that although passivity is the necessary condition of possibility of activity, activity can reconfigure the passive dimension that grounds and predelenates future activity. The bridge between passivity and activity is built through attention. In this regard, although the idea of mindfulness as a practice cannot be found in Husserl's philosophy, Husserlian descriptions can contribute to clarifying and even philosophically grounding some ideas underlying the practice of mindfulness. Thank you very much. for the attention.
Thank you, Celia, for that very interesting paper. We'll return to questions at the end of the three papers, as we said. So now we'll move on to Pierrick Simon.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you well, yeah.
That's great. You're still recording? All right, just setting up my notes. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your talks and your answers throughout the conference. They were really interesting. So I'm going to present you with a critique that Levinas made of phenomenology and show how it can serve as a critique of mindfulness. This critique will sound like a straightforward moral condemnation because it deals with ethical worries. But bear in mind that Levinas himself never gave up on phenomenology, which gives us an indication as to how we should receive his analysis. And personally, mindfulness was very beneficial for me. So I don't want that to be heard as a takedown or a moral condemnation. So here's how I'm going to do this. Firstly, I'm going to explain Levinas's critique and why mindfulness meditators are uniquely well equipped to be receptive to it, in my view. Secondly, I'm going to redirect the critique of phenomenology against mindfulness. And this is the point where it will most sound like a moral condemnation, so bear with me. Thirdly, I'm going to argue that in spite of what it sounds like, we should not give up on mindfulness, we should not give up on phenomenology, and instead we should carefully separate the two and double down on their specificities, because they both have limited but very useful strengths. So let's begin with the critique of phenomenology. That critique in Levinas's work comes in the form of a suspicion. And the suspicion is that philosophers are guilty of creating theories to avoid troubling and alienating experiences. So the idea is that philosophical consolation is the most natural mode of philosophy. This is what we do best. This is what we dare to do, to quote Rosenzweig. Problem is, this philosophical consolation is an avoidance behavior. What is being avoided is true alterity. Basically, anything we cannot contain or comprehend. For example, death, pain, anguish. So very troubling things that are like true alterity. And the behavior to avoid all of that is to create philosophies that grant ultimate autonomy to the subject. Because then from the subject's point of view, from the completely autonomous subject's point of view, otherness is just more of the same, just sameness, and not so troubling after all. And that prevents alterity, that prevents ethics, basically, that prevents relationship with other people and with God and otherness. And that's why Levinas is very critical of that. So Levinas applies that suspicion to Husserl's philosophy. For example, he will claim that Husserl's concept of intentionality is not fit for welcoming true alterity. And to argue that, he will focus on the teleological structure of intentionality. The idea here is that consciousness aims towards objects, and so we can describe how acts of meaning have the end goal of intuitive fulfillment. So there's an insistence on the end goal, that we can guess or predict. And so with that structure, acts of meaning, looking for confirmation, intuitive fulfillment, in that framework, the intuition we obtain describes meaning as identification. What's meaningful is identifying the object that we were aiming at in the first place. And that's where our eureka moment happens, when we identify what we were looking for, which stands in contrast with Levinas's thought of meaning as excess or overwhelm. We'll see that. And so we have that framework, we have intuitive fulfillment, we have meaning as identification. And in Husserl's view, this is a source of legitimate knowledge, which we call evidence. And that entire thing is suspect for Levinas, because what is given does not exceed what is aimed at. So in a way, we get exactly what we were hoping for, in a way. And so we're going to say, Levinas is going to say that intentionality works as a will to power, a very Nietzschean will to power, which seeks to translate otherness into sameness, and therefore affirm the self-sufficiency of consciousness. So the accusation is an accusation of narcissism, basically, of glorifying sameness. Now, that suspicion, that accusation, reflects a certain intellectual milieu that Levinas is a part of. He's not, there's a lot of post-Husserlian phenomenologists who want to do exactly that, meaning to focus on phenomena that undermine the Husserlian ideas of a self-sufficient transcendental subject and of the primacy of objectifying intentionality. There's a lot of phenomenologists like that who want to accuse Husserl of intellectualism and to target those features of his philosophy. And Levinas is part of that group and is very influenced by Heidegger. Very early in his reading of Husserl is influenced by more existentialist phenomenologies. But Levinas also wants to specify how his critique is different from that of his colleagues. So hence the modification from intellectualism to an accusation of narcissism. And eventually, he also aspires to apply that suspicion against his colleagues and against Heidegger, for instance. So you might think that Heidegger is a very unlikely suspect for that type of suspicion, because Heidegger has a philosophy of anguish. He advocates a non-evasive relationship with death, towards death, and he departs from Husserl in key ways. The transcendental subject, the objectifying intentionality, he departs from that. Nonetheless, Levinas wants to maintain the accusation. And so he has to make changes to it, but here's how he tries to do it. Levinas will claim that Heidegger does have a philosophy of anguish, but his anguish is terror towards the possibility of nothingness. And so Levinas will claim that in contrast, being is exalted as good. Basically, nothingness is a limitation on being, so being is good and nothingness is bad. And that's how Levinas views it. And so the accusation becomes an accusation of heroism when Levinas treats Heidegger, where essentially the shameless subject is obsessed with accomplishing its fate, thinking that being is good, limitation is bad, And so otherness, which is limitation, is evil. And Levinas wants to claim the opposite as a reaction, wants to say that being is evil and otherness is good, and thinks that Heidegger is saying the opposite. So here we have uncovered two dimensions of Levinas's suspicion. We have narcissism and we have heroism. But together they help uncover a third one, which is, interestingly enough, equanimity or serene indifference. That's another thing that is suspected and critiqued. And I think that's evident. It just arises evidently in the way Levinas treats both narcissism and heroism, because against narcissism, Levinas leverages the trope of invasive trouble, meaning trouble coming from the outside. The idea here is that we have a solipsistic subject, and alterity, otherness, breaks into the solipsistic subject who couldn't expect that. And it breaks its serenity, its solipsistic serenity. Against heroism, the trope is going to be different. It's not going to be invasive trouble, it's going to be intrinsic trouble, trouble coming from the inside. And that's where we get the Levinasian trope of claustrophobia that we saw earlier in this conference, the trope of feeling stifled and trapped by being, which is evil, and needing an escape from it in the form of otherness. And that is supposed to ruin the serenity of heroism. So now, depending on what trope you focus on, you might have a very different idea of what Levinas is up to. For example, the philosopher François David Seba analyzes Levinas, the way Levinas equates being and evil, and suggests as a result that the philosophical legitimacy of Levinas's starting point must be a method of pleonasm, where redundancy produces meaning and produces apodictic evidence, so like a pleonasm. In other words, being is strictly synonymous with evil, but to talk of being as evil in a redundant yet meaningful way helps to show the a priori structure of experience. So if you agree with that, you will tend to insist on all that is circular in Levinas's work. And there are circular features. For example, his version of the hermeneutical circle, where the moral necessity of alterity is established by the insufficiency of sameness, but conversely, the insufficiency of sameness is established by the moral necessity of alterity. I'll say that once more because it can be hard to follow. So the loop, the circle, is that the moral necessity of alterity is established by the insufficiency of sameness of being, but that's only because the insufficiency of sameness is already established by the moral necessity of alterity or otherness. So there's a circle, and it does exist in Levinas's thought. It can be criticized as a vicious circle. It does exist. I think it's a mistake to see it as the primary source of philosophical legitimacy. There must be some legitimacy that comes from the circular structure, but that's not the main argument, I think. I think that the critique of Heidegger is derived from the critique of Husserl, and so the trope of intrinsic trouble is derived from the trope of invasive trouble. If I'm right about that, then the philosophical legitimacy of Levinas's work has to do with a method of oxymoron, where the appearance of contradiction establishes apodictic evidence. And such an oxymoron could be suffering consciousness or vulnerable consciousness. It's meant to be an oxymoron, to be a contradiction that yields meaning. The idea is that it should strike us as strange that consciousness should ever come to suffer. The serene indifference of consciousness seems guaranteed, and yet it is not. And it leads Levinas to have a very interesting phenomenology of suffering, where it's so unexpected, you couldn't have made that up. So it's just suffering is coming out of nowhere. So this is where I'm tempted to draw a parallel with mindfulness, because the more mindful you are, the more surprising it can be that consciousness can suffer. And so Levinas can really speak to you on that front. And this is because in mindfulness meditation, the dispelling of suffering relies on a contemplative attitude, which is thought to be intrinsic to consciousness or to imitate some deep feature of consciousness. When you're meditating, you don't think it's an arbitrary point of view. You think you're imitating or using a very deep feature of consciousness, which is contemplation. And this is why I think that mindful people can be better readers of Levinas than non-mindful people, because first of all, his method relies on the intuition that consciousness is somehow naturally expected to be impervious to suffering. That's a very strange and rare intuition to have, I think. But I think also it should sound familiar to mindfulness practitioners. Secondly, if you're mindful of affects, you are less likely to think that Levinas finds legitimacy in the circularity of his hermeneutic circle. And that's because his entire work strikes you as a dramatic depiction of the trouble you run into when you adopt a method which is not open enough to surprises. And so circularity is not great because it's not open enough to the unexpected. But again, for that dramatic depiction to speak to you, you need to be both aware of suffering and of the desire to overcome it, which I think, again, should be familiar to meditators. So then, as a result, I feel like mindfulness meditators are in this uneasy situation where they are primed to understand Levinas, but it seems that they're being called out for engaging in an unethical practice, an avoidance behavior, which brings me to examining how this critique applies to mindfulness. So mindfulness involves a suspension of judgment and going back to things themselves, as per the definition of paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So it calls for an absence of preconceived ideas, much like phenomenology, but it's easier to use the Levinasian suspicion against mindfulness because here I feel like it's obvious that mindfulness is embedded in a culture of therapy where a mindfulness meditator knows that they meditate in order to transcend trouble or to solve trouble. And if you disagree with that, more on that later. I think it's an interesting discussion. So mindfulness is typical of the therapeutic optimism that Levinas is worrying about because of three features. The first, an optimism of innocent intentions, where we have an excellent subject, a subject which is innocent, self-sufficient, and a legitimate source of knowledge. Secondly, an optimism of elucidation, which is more than intellectualism. That's what Levinas is worrying about, the idea that anything can be brought to the light of consciousness, the idea that anything in principle can become an object of contemplation. And thirdly, you have a false open-endedness to the method, where it's implicitly or even explicitly assumed that the dispelling of suffering is the natural endpoint of the inquiry and the sign that you've examined the object enough. And if anything contradicts that, you need to be more mindful, need to keep going. So that's the Levinasian accusation. So is there a way to reject that accusation right away if it's too ridiculous or something? There's two possible immediate objections. The first would be that it's a gross exaggeration, meaning it captures the virtue of mindfulness, but somehow it turns it into a vice for no good reason. I think the counter objection to that would be that this analysis is still useful to criticize how mindfulness is commodified. And we've talked about Mac mindfulness, for example. And so if it's useful for that, it might mean that caricatures can serve an ethical purpose. And so it can serve a purpose to caricature something. The second immediate objection would be to say that it's completely off the mark. It understands nothing about mindfulness. For example, it's not true to say that mindfulness practitioners meditate in order to transcend trouble. My counter objection to that would be that in order to make that case, you either need to argue that the therapeutic virtue of mindfulness is completely incidental or inexistent, and I think that's not reasonable, or you need to argue that it is relatively incidental. And there, you would argue that, I think, by emphasizing certain aspects of the spiritual paths and how a spiritual path differs from a philosophical theory. But if you do that, I think you're still confronted with some of Levinas's best arguments. So for example, if you choose to argue from the point of view of subitism, which is a word that designates a spiritual path where enlightenment is sudden, because in a way it was always already there, you just failed to recognize it. You didn't really have to put in any effort, you just had to understand it. It was already there, but there was an illusion that was toying with you. So if you argue from that point of view, I think you have to defend an illusory view of suffering. And then you have to face Levinas's trope of invasive trouble. And you have to face his own description of suffering, which is more convincing, I think, where suffering is too unexpected and alien to be an illusion. You were not even expecting it. If, on the other hand, you argue from gradualism, which is a spiritual path where awakening is achieved through gradual transformation of your mind until you get to it. If you argue from that place, you have to defend your heroic project and face Levinas's trope of intrinsic trouble. And for example, you have to answer the question, well, how can you make sure that what you're doing is not wrong? For example, how can you make sure you're not amputating your healthy capacity for boredom? and that's a problem with mindfulness. So all of that to say that you cannot avoid answering the Levinasian critique. The main question to answer is, with phenomenology and mindfulness, how ready are we to take experiences that contradict us into account? And then I think Levinas has a point and raises a good challenge for us. So what are we to do about this critique? As I alluded to, I don't think it's a damning moral critique. I think that Levinas develops meta-ethical reflections that are meant to reform phenomenological method so as to make room for surprises. And so I would like to propose a strategy for that. And the strategy would be to inject more pragmatism and pluralism into phenomenology and mindfulness. So let's take this one at a time. I think that phenomenology might be too similar to mindfulness in the way that it can default to a soft philosophical consolation and have a bias towards equanimity. I think it might be better to acknowledge that there's a plurality of possible phenomenological reductions, each specified by different starting assumptions and each anchored to different target experiences. So in the case of a phenomenology of equanimity, the target is the oceanic feeling, that feeling of joy and peace and oneness with the universe. Whereas in the case of a phenomenology of vulnerability, the goal is the mysterium tremendum, the feeling of horror and terror while facing mysterious otherness. Conversely, it might be that mindfulness is too similar to phenomenology right now, by which I mean any ontological phenomenology. The problem is that their proponents argue that the philosophical legitimacy of mindfulness comes from its ability to uncover ontological truths in an unbiased way. And that's what distinguishes it from brainwashing, for example, which would be like, it's all practical with no justification. And I think the fix here is to draw on traditions of Buddhist philosophies that are completely comfortable with saying that the goal is not primarily ontological truths, it's just to attain a certain experience. And if that experience is taken to be the oceanic feeling, that's good, but it might be a little limited by the boundaries of the phenomenology of equanimity. If we want mindfulness itself to be more pluralistic, instead the experience, the target experience might just be the reduction of suffering purely and simply. And there mindfulness will be able to include the wisdom of Levinas as well, the phenomenology of vulnerability. And that's all for me. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Pierrick. We're now going to move on to Christos, who's going to come to hit the podium. Christos is presenting on Heidegger against the Stoics on mindfully overcoming uncanny feelings.
Okay. Listen, what the value is. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm gonna give a very bad presentation. And I was on Wednesday morning, I was trying to decide. I hadn't even thought about what I wanted to say or the abstract I had written. And I was trying to decide what would be the least impolite thing to do, or whether to withdraw myself from the program or whether to give it a try and say something. So you decide for yourselves and tell me which one it will have been. I hope you don't suffer from this. So let me just read out the abstract first, so that you know the context of in which or from which these thoughts have emerged. So my intention is to write something like a critical, like a Heidegger critique of the Stoics. So the title is Heidegger against the Stoics on mindfulness and uncanny feelings. And the chapter is meant to compare and contrast two competing models of mindfulness, a Heideggerian model and a Stoic model, focusing on the way they respectively theorize affective states and the normative ideal of well-being, thus delineating opposing stances and therapeutic options regarding extremely negative or uncanny feelings, namely angst, anxiety. The first section will clarify the Stoic idea of the sage and the ideal of freedom from emotions, apatheia. Emotions will be theorized using a cognitivist model and will be identified as products of bad judgment, which must and can be eliminated cognitively. Then the section will analyze the naturalist principle of oikeiosis, appropriation or familiarization, as the telos of mindfulness, which permeates the whole process of becoming sage. The second section will look at Heidegger's early phenomenology and will argue that in Being and Time, the Heideggerian sage, the human being that exists authentically, let's say, is someone who does not try to overcome angst, anxiety, which is intrinsically tied to the feeling of uncanniness or unhomeliness, but rather cultivates a comportment that embraces this emotion, or this Stimmung. Here, the sage is called to own up to their latent angst and sense of unhomeliness, a feeling that amounts to a philosophical destination and which rehabilitates the human being's existential condition and its well-being, bringing it back to its unsettled inner nature. Finally, the Heideggerian model of mindfulness will be conceived along the lines of phronetic prudence, opposed to a cognitivist reflective model that characterizes Stoic mindfulness. That's my abstract, and now what I thought about this abstract. And it's not technical, I'm afraid, and there are no references. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'll start by saying that I had underestimated how much work organizing this conference would involve, and I thought I would have time in the last week to write something. However, this was not the case. So it's Thursday, June 2nd, 6 a.m. as I'm writing these lines. So I will present to you the general idea of where I want to go with this paper and see if I can raise some issues that I find troubling and in need to resolve. My initial idea for the paper, the initial intention, was to compare and contrast two approaches, two ways of thinking about mindfulness, the Heideggerian and the Stoic, which amount to two entirely different viewpoints that at a first glance are entirely incompatible with one another, so much so that it would seem as a fruitless task. The incompatibility between the Heideggerian project and the Stoic project is so glaring that it is even impossible to be made manifested, as you cannot compare two entirely different projects that have different aims and that operate on a different register. For example, it will indeed involve so much hermeneutic violence exerted onto Heidegger's philosophy that one can easily object that my take of Heidegger, at least for the purposes of this paper, is not just controversial, but it is un-Heideggerian, entirely outside the spirit of Heidegger's ontological project. To begin with, Heidegger's philosophy is not in any way connected or reducible to a practical philosophy or any sort of self-help philosophy that aims at offering a way of life or describing a particular way of life, or that can offer any therapeutic advice for any psychological issues one may have, and in particular emotional issues. Another problem would be to try and squeeze out the notion of mindfulness that would resemble the practice of mindfulness close to what, for example, Kabat-Zinn describes. Although, as several papers have by now pointed out, that despite the differences and the seeming impossibility to develop a version of mindfulness from within Heidegger's philosophy is not an impossible task. You probably have to move the goalposts in terms of what counts as mindfulness, but if you do, then you can reconstruct a Heideggerian version of mindfulness. From the perspective of Stoicism now, one has to engage in a bit of revisionism in order to identify a notion of mindfulness in Stoicism. While I think, and I'm not an expert, thankfully there is an expert here and he can completely demolish me. While Stoicism shares the practical character as well as the therapeutic application with mindfulness, the connection is still not as straightforward. As regards Stoic's philosophy connection to Heideggerian phenomenology, again, one has to concede that there isn't anything transcendental about Stoicism or any version of an ontological difference, which is so central to Heidegger's philosophy. Although I'm going to complicate things more and more, because I mean, I have read a chapter by Wayne Martin, who is at Essex, who he wrote a chapter which is, I think is entitled something like Stoic Transcendentalism, where he argues that the Stoics might have some sort of proto-transcendental argument, and he thinks the process of oikiosis, of appropriation, is a version of transcendentalism. It might be the first time there is something like a transcendental argument being made. I'm not sure I'm convinced by it, but I'm just trying to show that you always have someone arguing the opposite of what is the standard view. Okay, right. Yeah. So why then would someone go ahead and compare and contrast these two approaches? On what basis and with what philosophical justification? I raised a set of general objections as regards the compatibility or comparability even of Heidegger's philosophy to Stoicism. These are, I'll enumerate them, and I'm not sure I'm following them systematically as I'm developing the paper. The first one is the irreducibility of Heidegger's ontology to a practical philosophy. The second one is the irreducibility to a therapeutic application. The third is the irreducibility of the ontological to the ontic. Because speaking very crudely, Heidegger's project is ontological. There's nothing ontological in the Heideggerian sense. In the Stoics, it's an ontic philosophy. I haven't mastered an analytic response to these objections, but this is a preliminary response that I would give. So I would firstly counter-object with this, that while the ontological register in Heidegger is never reducible to the ontic, and while the analytic of Dasein is not reducible to a psychology or a sociology of Dasein, and while fundamental moods in being and time, the Grundstimmungen, are not reducible to emotions, and Heidegger repeats this all the time, and while also the praxial being character of Dasein, the ontological mode of Zuhandenheit, okay, it's an elliptical sentence. I would say that still the analytic of Dasein has to presuppose and begin with a version of the ontic, so with a certain ontical character, ontical presuppositions, ontic descriptions. There is no ontology without the ontic. So being in time is also a story of the ontic that becomes ontological, the non-philosophical, non-phenomenological that becomes phenomenological, the inauthentic that becomes authentic. To repeat this more correctly, it is that it involves a description of the pre-authentic that becomes authentic, the pre-phenomenological that becomes phenomenological, and so on and so forth. And therefore, Heidegger has to somehow inherit and repeat ontic philosophies, ontic theories, ontic anthropologies, ontic sociologies, or presuppositions that derive and biases that come from that register. So he inherits, in this context, he inherits a particular theory of emotion from Aristotle, or so he says, and I'll say more things on this later, which he will ontologize. So he inherits a specific understanding of fear that he will ontologize or will analyze in terms of ontology, and a whole lot of other ontic structures. He cannot even begin being in time without a version of the ontic. And even if the pre-ontological ontic is nowhere to be found in his text, it is a precondition that needs to be in the reader's, that this needs to be in the reader's head, in his or her mind, in order for Heidegger's text to do any ontological work and to have any meaning. To put it in more specific and concrete terms, if the reader of Being and Time doesn't read Stimmung, mood, and doesn't initially think of the psychological, mundane, ontic version of moods and emotions, then there is no transformative power in Heidegger's text. To put it otherwise, if Heidegger's admiration for Aristotle's discoveries regarding affectivity means that he thinks that Aristotle had said everything there was to be said about emotions and their ontological power, then it's as if he would be saying or assuming that Aristotle had already given us a complete description, a complete ontological version of Dasein, which would render Heidegger's ontology as unnecessary. It is therefore important for Heidegger scholarship too to examine Heidegger's anthropological presupposition and the related theory of emotions he's operating with at the ontic level, which would amount to looking at how close or how far his theory would be from the Stoic theory of emotions. At least that's what I want to do. So there are several hypotheses I made based on it. So these are my initial hypotheses or biases that I had in my mind when I initially thought of this abstract or this idea, this project, this essay. So there were several hypotheses I had made based on established understanding or misunderstanding and interpretations of the Stoic and of Heidegger. And some of them collapse upon scrutiny, I think, others not. And I will lay some of them down now, and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of the paper. I'm just going to raise some complications I'm finding out, in which I don't know exactly how to resolve or where it's going. So the general initial hypothesis that guided my paper or my proposal, my abstract, was quite simple, and it was this. There is a rejuvenation of Stoic philosophy lately, internationally, which is being appropriated or reappropriated by people working in cognitive behavioral therapy, just CBT. Just like CBT has been successfully married with Buddhist-inspired versions of mindfulness, like John Kabat-Zinn's. Likewise, CBT can also be married with Stoic philosophy and have produce a Stoic version of mindfulness. but the appropriation has come from the other side too, or has taken place from the other side too, namely that Stoic philosophers have also been trying to repurpose Stoic philosophy so as to develop a Stoic version of mindfulness. And I think there are some papers where they focus on the notion of prosoche. I don't know how you translate it, attention. Yeah. And I cannot judge whether that's accurate from within Stoic philosophy or not. So what is the theoretical basis that allows this marriage to take place? It is a shared cognitivist, or one of the theoretical bases. It is a shared cognitivist theory of emotions and the possibility of a cognitively based therapy. There is also a shared practical interest in the ideal of freedom from passions, apatheia, specifically negative, stressful emotions such as fear and anxiety, as well as a shared interest in the establishment or re-establishment of harmony, of the individual being in harmony with the environment, with the world, with nature, the overcoming of alienation and defamiliarization, and the feeling of not being at home in the world. In other words, the practical aim of oikeiosis. Heidegger, on the other hand, at least the early Heidegger of Being and Time, not only considers these negative emotions, specifically fear and anxiety, as important, rather, they are indispensable to the whole project of ontological awakening. The authentic Dasein must be anxious. Of course, Heidegger is not consistent or about whether he, so it's unclear whether he thinks in Being and Time that one can become authentic via other moods, or whether anxiety is the primordial mood and there is no other, and namely that's the only way to become authentic. So anxiety, so Dasein must be anxious. Anxiety is the fundamental mood in Being and Time, and defamiliarization, the sense of uncanniness, being uncanny even, is a necessary precondition in order to attain authentic understanding and become authentic. So it's not something you're trying to escape. It's something you go towards. So at the first glance, it's like the opposite movement. If you compare where the Stoics are trying to go and where Heidegger of Being and Time is trying to do. To use the vocabulary that Min-Hong Chu used yesterday, which is appropriate here, or some of it, anxiety and uncanniness are methodologically necessary so as to enact the shift from the mundane to the transcendental, from the ontic to the ontological. What is more, for Heidegger, emotions, affects are not cognitivist appraisals, rather they have their own peculiar mode of disclosure. To rephrase it better, they are a mode of disclosure that exceeds or precedes cognition and intuition too, because he says they are not Anschauungen, it's not Anschauung. And Befindlichkeit, or state of mind, is as Heidegger disposition, is as Heidegger says in Being and Time, equiprimordial to understanding, verstehen, and hence irreducible to understanding. And so, and I think everything cognitive would fall on the side of understanding. Not wrong. And so at the first glance, or judgment would be an operation of understanding. And so at the first glance, Heidegger would seem to be the opposing pole to the Stoic approach, where the Stoic would use a version of mindfulness as therapy for passions such as fear and anxiety, and specifically fear connected to death, fear of death. The early Heidegger would have a version of mindfulness, resoluteness, that would seek to enact, awaken, and embrace fear of death, anxiety, and the uncanny as, let's say, a form of therapy from the forgetfulness of being, from metaphysics, from the malady of inauthenticity and the sheer ontic. Right. So now I'm gonna say a few things that I think undermine some of these presuppositions that I have mentioned. So to what extent is this understanding of the Stoics justified? Looking at the Stoics more carefully, one realizes that the picture, or the history rather, is much more complicated. And the initial hypothesis, or my initial hypothesis, which is, I think, what many people assume is the case, is too simplistic. To begin with, there isn't a unified theory of emotions in Stoicism, so one has to clarify which Stoics one means. It is true that modern cognitive therapy has many things in common with Stoic therapy, but the kind of therapy they approach also depends on the underlying theory of emotion, of what one takes an emotion to be. So if you don't know what an emotion is, how will you work with it or to eliminate it? You need an approach that would be based on a definition. For example, there is the question of the relation between emotion and cognition, and emotion and judgment. There is no agreement among the Stoics on this, even though there is a standard view, or the most established view, which is, I think, Chrysippus's view, which differs from Zeno's view. Let me begin by saying that when the Stoics refer to emotion, they are referring to pathos, to passion. So the notion of passion is not exactly the same thing as what we mean when we say emotion nowadays. And indeed, they all agree that passions are pernicious and should be eradicated so as to achieve a state of apatheia, as opposed to, say, Aristotle's metriopatheia. However, since passion is not identical to the modern notion of emotion, and some emotions are not passions, one needs to ask whether the Stoic sage can indeed feel some emotions, or whether he or she will be totally emotionless. So if the passions do not, if emotions are a bigger category than passions, and you get rid of passions, then you might be left with some emotions that are fine to be experienced, and that you don't need to get rid of, and you don't need therapy for them. According to Zeno, passions are not so much about a mistaken judgment, but rather they emerge when one goes against one's own true and better judgment. And so passions are inappropriate phenomena that signify that one is going against one's own rational nature, that one is disobedient to his or her reason. So passions are not bad judgments for Zeno, or appraisals themselves, although they are implicated with judgment, insofar as one judges that, say, X is useful or wrong, and yet one, so if one, yes, and yet one disobeys their reason and avoids it while it has judged that it's useful, or they go ahead and do it against the judgment that it is wrong to do. So going against the judgment. The definition ascribed to Zeno is that passions are movements of the soul. It is a kinetic or somatic phenomenon, and in that respect, insofar as passions refer to something kinetic, that's my word. I don't know if it's okay to use it in this context. Huh? Is it? Okay, great.
But it's accepted.
Okay. It is insofar as it is, in that respect, insofar as passions refer to something kinetic, I'm not sure how far away it would be from what Heidegger is trying to describe with moods and plasticity in being and time. However, for Zeno, passions are movements of the soul contrary to nature, rational nature. Heidegger would never agree with this, quite the opposite. Where Zeno privileges the rational capacities of the soul, Heidegger privileges, I think, the affective. So that's debatable. Given Zeno's definitions of emotion, passion, where does this leave us in terms of freedom from emotions and apatheia? Does it mean that the ideal human being, the sage, is totally emotionless? Not really, because it is possible to feel emotions that are in line with rational judgment, which would mean they are not passions anymore. They're not passions per se. They are not irrational impulses. They are emotions that are appropriate and in line with judgment. The other important, how much do I have? Oh, I thought, okay. The other important Stoic to refer to here, apart from Zeno, is Chrysippus, who has developed the standard view of emotions. According to Chrysippus, emotions are identified with evaluative judgments. They consist of evaluative judgments. For every emotion involves two distinct evaluative judgments. The first judgment concerns the judgment of whether something is good or bad, and the other, the second judgment, concerns whether it is appropriate, kathekon, to react to it. While for Chrysippus, therapy from passions would involve some form of cognitive modification, for Zeno, it is not necessarily a modification of judgment, but our relation to judgment that makes a difference, because it may be the case that the judgment is correct and the passion arises not because the value judgment is wrong, but because we go against the judgment and disobey it. So one false presupposition we have regarding Chrysippus's position is that he aims at the total eradication of emotions, which is not true, I find. There is such a thing as the so-called eupatheia, the good emotions, let's say, or the good passions, that are appropriate for one to feel. For example, the sage would feel joy when in the presence of good things and when living in accordance with nature and truth, and it would be an appropriate emotion for the sage to feel, as it would not be a passion, really. Here, one needs to point out that Heidegger himself in Being and Time refers to joy as a mood that one feels when authentic, so when the truth of being has been disclosed. And I don't think we discuss often about the mood of joy and how it's this peculiar mood that when one is authentically anxious, but also joyful because of the connection with truth, which is, I think, something he inherits. It's a theory of emotions that he inherits from the past. So it's nothing new, really. So even the Stoics had it. Another false belief we have about Chrysippus regarding the emotion of fear, and specifically fear of death, is the reason it is irrational to fear death is because death falls within the sphere of indifference and hence does not fall within the sphere of ethics, as it is neither good nor evil. It is not something we can control, we cannot do something about it. So it is standard to assume that from Chrysippus's perspective, fear of death is irrational and hence one needs to overcome it as an emotion by way of cognitive modification, so as to get rid of the false belief involved, of course. But not only about fear, but also the same holds for anxiety too. But is this entirely true? It's not, I think, because the passion of fear or anxiety has a rational version, which is the product of true belief, of knowledge, and of an appropriate response to it. This means that there is a fairly wide scope of emotions that the sage can have, consistent with the veridical assessment of the values of good and indifferent around him or her. And so I can imagine that the Stoics or the Chrysipian approach, there could be a way to experience anxiety as a proper emotion, but I'm not sure it would be necessarily connected to death or how it would be. So the equivalent, the rational equivalent of anxiety or fear is what Chrysippus calls caution, which would be the rational equivalent of desire or fear. So I said that. So it would not be a passion anymore, but a selection, an ekloge. So if the sage judges truly and appropriately according to reason, that he or she chooses to feel cautious, i.e., be appropriately afraid or anxious about an object or event. In this regard, we need to more carefully contrast it with Heideggerian authenticity, insofar as authenticity involves resolutely owning up to one's anxiety. Of course, it is not a matter of judgment in the Stoic sense, but there is a notion of decision and childhood involved in being and time, and therefore angst authentically experienced is no longer a matter of brute affect, but it does involve understanding and some form of appraisal. It's not cognitive, but there is some form of appraisal involved. Otherwise, the mood would not be able to do any of the work it is doing. And therefore, a comparison between Heidegger and the Stoics is a more complicated thing than I initially had thought it would. So, indeed, in Being and Time, moods, Befindlichkeit is distinct from Verstehen, understanding, where a function of which is judgment, but it is always already implicated in it. And Dasein cannot have sheer Stimmung or Befindlichkeit that is not always already co-determined or co-constituted by Verstehen, and perhaps by judgment too, at least at the derivative level. Finally, let me briefly mention another unwarranted presupposition regarding Heidegger's connections to the Stoics, especially his theory of emotions, the one he inherited, Being and Time. In Being and Time, Heidegger argues more or less that Aristotle had said everything there was to be said about emotions, and that since Aristotle, there was no progress made as regards emotions. For a long time, I myself believed that, and always looked at Aristotle and the homologies between Heidegger and Aristotle in order to interpret his understanding of moods. 5 years ago, at a conference I organized when I was UCD, and Dermot Moran had given a paper, and he had argued that Heidegger borrowed heavily from Scheler, if I remember. Is that what you had there? And indeed, he's right. It took me a while to realize it. And I had initially undermined that. But if we follow that line, that genealogy, we find Augustine. And then that heavily influenced Being in Time's focus on fear and anxiety, and of course, St. Paul. So the focus on fear and anxiety in their togetherness with guilt. And behind Augustine, we find the Stoic theory of emotion. We encounter Posidonius's objections to Chrysippus and the introduction of the notion of first movements, the propathie, that were postulated in order to defend Chrysippus against the objections of Posidonius. It's a complicated story, and I'm not sure I got it right, but this is my sense. So Posidonius had objected that one can have emotions without, against the argument that one can have emotions. No, sorry, he had objected that to Chrysippus that one can have emotions without judgment, as is the case of music, with music, for example. In order to accommodate that, the Chrysipian theory, the idea of first movement, i.e. of pre-rational or pre-reflective passion, was introduced, which Augustine, if I'm not wrong, incorporated in his own theory of emotions, which he connected them with sins, though, I think. So he connected guilt with passions that is, I'm not sure it's mediated by reason. And here I want to wonder how close this is to Heidegger's own presuppositions and his theory, the tacit theory of emotions he's operating with in Being and Time, which comes from a theological context. But ultimately, following doing a genealogy, I think you will find that he has inherited something from the Stoic. And I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Considering that was last minute, it's quite impressive. Yeah, I think maybe sometimes when we do things quickly, they have a natural flow to them, which
Yeah.
they don't have when we spend too much time thinking about it. So let's open the questions. I think how we'll do it is we'll take everybody one by one. So we'll start with Celia, and we'll open up questions for Celia's presentation. I'll just turn the camera over here. And if anyone has any questions, they can post them in the chat as well. We have one in the chat. Is there anyone in the audience first? No? Okay, so Celia, you can look in the chat.
Yeah,
I'll read it out for everyone over here as well. This is from Andrea Scanziani. I just want to ask if it is possible to speak in Husserl's phenomenology of an emotional or sensible attention. That is, an attention which does not immediately refer to a mere intentional object, as in the logical investigations, and yet does not overwhelm the subject completely, as discussed in Husserl-Geiger's debate. And how can we then understand the relationship between this emotional attention and the doxic emotional act, given that attention emphasizes the act generally, maybe in terms of foreground and background?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for the question. So emotional attention. Yes, so in the paper, I refer to ways of turning attention to emotions, but I think this is difficult. This is a very difficult question. But so we should find a form of privilege of experience that is exclusively emotional. I would say that we can find something like that in the emotion of love in Husserl, which is an emotional act and has this function of preference and privileging. So there is a special form of being with in love that can make it very close to attention in an emotional sense. So it's a long question. I'm still reading it. And yet does not overwhelm the subject completely. Okay, so love can be overwhelming. Yes, maybe some form of love, because love has different levels according to Husserl. Maybe in some level, love can be compared as an emotional form of attention. I will have to think more about this. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions? So there's another one in the chat. You spoke of feeling sensations. What would they be? Is it auto-experience, auto-affectivity? Would that be something that we sense or feel, for instance, when we meditate?
Yes, so I didn't go very deep in the concept, in the difference between intentional and non-intentional feelings, because that's something quite tricky. It's something that Husserl develops in the fifth logical investigation, where he discusses the possibility of speaking of intentionality in the sphere of feelings, and he says that there are some affective experiences which are intentional and others which are not, and among those affective non-intentional experiences, Husserl speaks about feeling sensations, which is the translation of Gefühlsempfindungen. And so he understands this as analogous to empfindnis, and they would be founded and also connected in a, they are very, very, I don't know which is the word in English, is verschmolzen. They are, yes, very, very near to sensible sensations. So the main difference between emotions and feeling sensations is the lack of intentionality. So if I feel pain, pain does not. So if I feel pain, I could hardly say which is the object of my pain, contrary to joy, which there is a possibility to identify what I am feeling joy for. Regarding this auto-affectivity, I'm not sure if I will call it like this, but it is something that we feel. The usual examples are pleasure and pain as these feeling sensations, and I think we can feel those when we meditate. But in order to understand that, I think, yes, I should analyze more which would be the possible relation between this emotion, like feeling as intentional act, and which impact would it have in the possibility of having feeling sensations, because feeling sensations are something that just happened to me. So we can feel them when we meditate, but the relationship between that and attention and willing is more difficult than in the case of emotion, of intentional feelings. Thank you.
Okay, we also have a question in the audience from Dermot Moran. Would you like?
Thank you. Yes, for the first speaker. And again, it's true that Shaler has a large discussion of the distinction between bodily feelings. He speaks about vital feelings, hunger, thirst, tiredness, and then more general emotional feelings, that run through the whole body. But there's a really deep analysis of this in Edith Stein. He talks about, in fact, a lot about different depths of pain and other feelings in the body. So she says, like, a toothache takes place on the surface of the ego, is her phrase. But other things like grief, penetrate through to the depths of the ego. So she sees not that they're unintentional, but that there are different degrees of ego involvement in our experiences of sensation, bodily, proprioception, down to
thank you.
Emotion. And she thinks she's just elaborating Shaler and Husserl.
Yes, thank you for the comment. I was aware of the treatment of the topic in Shaler, and I know that in some regards, the Shaler's descriptions of this depth of emotional life is even more elaborated than in Husserl. So there is this stratification of emotional life, which, and I think what's interesting is that these different strata can be analyzed regarding different perspectives, not only intentionality, but also what you mentioned about ego involvement, relation between the emotion and the body, relation between attention and the feeling. So in that respect, I think that, yes, Shaler's work is very interesting. And I'm not very familiar with Edith Stein's work, so I take note of that. Thank you.
I just add one thing which connects actually to Christos's paper. Both Shaler and Stein also distinguish between feelings and moods. And one of the point about the mood is that it's not located in the body. You're located in it, as it were, which is exactly how Heidegger describes it also.
Yes. Yes. So for yes, because at least in Husserl, moods are complex because he understands moods as intentional, contrary to Heidegger, but I think the phenomenon of mood somehow challenges the idea of intentionality because it's not object directed, as other emotional phenomena, but he tries to keep the idea of intentionality. I think the key is the idea of horizon intentionality, like the system of references, potential implications. But anyway, that's I think moods is a concept which really, really forces the idea of intentionality and shows the different levels and strata of intentionality itself. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to Pierrick now. Question for Pierrick. Yeah.
Hi, Pierrick. It's Klein. First of all, thanks for your paper and showing me how much I missed in Levinas. So thanks. Just exciting to go back and find more. So when you talk about this accusation, do I understand correctly? It's an accusation to the whole project of thought, right? It's not an accusation to the ego who's trying to escape.
Right. So your question is, who is being accused?
Who is being accused when you're talking about, the accusation of narcissism, heroism?
Yeah. Well, it's basically phenomenology, and Levinas never fully renounces phenomenology, but he accuses a certain type of phenomenology of all the things that I talked about. And he thinks that there is a quote unquote permanent phenomenology, an idea that's quite similar to perennialism, where phenomenology is not just Husserl. You can find it in ancient thought, and so yes, that's his aim. I think it's very productive to see him as a suspicious philosopher who uses a suspicion to interpret certain texts. He will accuse Husserl, accuse Heidegger.
So that gets me to my question, because I wanted to get that.
Sorry.
So there's sort of a project, and parallel to that, there's the project of the ego who's trying to escape sort of the horror of being. So in a way, sort of, there's like two parallel projects for the individual and for this system of thought, if you like. And on the level of the ego, there's, the project is doomed to fail, and the failure results in shame. So is there a parallel there then for sort of this the project as a whole? Does shame also sort of, is it operative in the thinking as a whole, or does it not figure at all?
So if I understand your question correctly, my answer would be that Levinas takes phenomenology to be very open, and so to encounter things that will force it to change. For example, we talked about pain not being intentional or something like that. And Levinas will zero in on that and say, well, if that's the case, maybe we have to tell a different story about suffering. And I'm not sure I've encountered the idea that there's shame involved, but there's definitely the idea that phenomenology is both very open and falsely open, hence why Levinas is ambiguous about it, rejects it, but never abandons it, because he feels like it's self-correcting. but we have to do that work of self-correction. I've never seen the idea of shame, though, attached to that.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Pierrick? We have from Ingeborg in the chat. I'll read it out loud. You can read it in the chat as well, Pierrick. What struck me in mindfulness practice was the stress on noticing time and again when you are not aware. So this notion of beginning time and again for me relates to the openness to life and to an openness to surprise and alterity. What are your thoughts about that in light of Levinas' critique?
Yes, so I answered that a little bit in my previous answer, where the same way Levinas thinks that phenomenology is maximally open, but at the same time, the self-correction happens only if someone does it. I think it relates to mindfulness too, where I completely agree that there's an openness to surprise and an openness to life. And that's why, in a sense, the critique of phenomenology or the critique of mindfulness comes from the practice itself. You just start noticing when it's not open enough. And so it's self-correcting in a way, but you have to do the work of criticizing it as you're doing it. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. From Petri, can we actually understand that mindfulness is an open presence to the face of the other?
Can we actually understand that mindfulness is an open presence to the face of the other? So could we make it that way, or because it depends. It's I think there are elements where there is a tendency for mindfulness to not be open to alterity, but as I said, it's self-correcting. You notice that, and then you try to correct it. But I certainly want to make it that way, to take Levinas's phenomenology and to a bit like Clive Zammit, who wanted to complete the practice with the insights of Levinas, but also complete Levinas with the insight of the practice. Hence, pluralism, I think, is the answer here.
Okay, thank you. We'll just have some final questions for Christos as well in the last 5 minutes. Yep.
One is just a reference. I think you were talking about the notion of ideal. There's a passage I always remember it because just around the time that I finished working on the supervisor decided to throw that passage at me. Actually, when I was studying my PhD, sometime. Anyway, I got it in the book afterwards. I didn't put it into the time, but it's paragraph 62. So it'd be 310 German, 358 after the line there. Is there not, however, a definite possible way of taking authentic practical ideal of that and underlying or enforcing? That is so indeed.
Yeah, so it basically confirms my sense that
I think it'd be a good passage.
yeah, because
I think there's another way of reading it, but
okay.
That you could marshal it.
Well, I didn't mean it exactly that way, but this is even better, I think, in the sense that it gives you a concrete or existential option there. Namely, if you cannot transform yourself in a particular way, then how would one be able to become authentic and
anyway, hopefully.
Yeah, it helps. I'll use it. Thank you.
And then I suppose I was trying to figure out how one would reconstruct on the notion of death being towards death, the three different kinds that Heidegger thinks about in being time. So you Berlin and Ableben, and then times really only the third one, perishing or demising and all that.
Yeah.
And so it seems like an obvious impact. And I would think of it that way. But there's another way, I think, maybe, and maybe this is what you were getting at, where you could say, well, look, Epicurus seems to be thinking about Berlin and perishing. Well, no point in worrying about that, it won't be there anymore. There's a sense, there's passages in being a time where Heidegger almost, well, this sort of fear in the face of death, and it characterizes it almost as like a lack of fortitude, talking the dying person out of death, people fleeing from it. But there's a sense in which he thinks that the possibility of not just authentic existence, but any kind of authentic existence involves embracing it, part of who you are. And in that way, he's indifferent to perishing. He's almost even indifferent to mind. But you could reconstruct it in a way. I don't know that I fully buy it personally, but
no, but it's a thank you. It's a clever comment, and it might help me see if identify places where Heidegger is not so un-Stoic, or that there is a version of Stoicism
yeah,
there.
you said yourself. I mean, when he's thinking about angst, very, very low level. At times he's just talking about there's something coloring the capacity to effectively situate the world. So he thinks about it on quite a technical level. So it's not quite clear. I'm not talking about, not interested in either with that. But I think he could. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, these will go in my text, I predict.
Okay. I think that's all. If anybody else has any other questions, I suggest the best way is to email or write a message somewhere. Okay, so we're going to go off for a break now, and we return in 20 minutes. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks.